Please.
All right, I want to thank Yoram for giving me this opportunity.
Rabbi Yoram.
It's okay. Tell me.
Rabbi
No,
Yoram.
it's okay. It's okay.
Rabbi Yoram.
It's okay.
Sorry.
No. It's okay.
What would I do without Benny to correct me? I'm going to pass out some materials, but I'm going to leave it for a little bit later because I find when you pass out materials at the beginning, people start reading through them and they don't listen to what you're saying. So let me just indicate, the more I work at my job, in January it will be 30 years I've been a judge, the more I realize how much our modern American legal system is based on Torah principles. And so I just want to identify a few of those principles, and some of them go very well with what Yoram was talking about earlier. And I also want to relate a few experiences I've had in court over the years that I think reflect some Torah ideas. Now, as Yoram said in Parsha Shoftim, there are a couple of commands that relate directly to our system of justice. One of them is Shoftim v'shotrim, judges and officers shall you appoint. And the other is Tzedek Terdaf, justice shalt thou pursue. And those ideas, those commands reflect Hashem's understanding that without a system of law, a system of justice, a society descends into chaos. Without people being able to rely on an organized system of justice, it's just human nature for people to take the law into their own hands. And we see what happens in societies where that's the case. And a civilized society cannot exist that way. The people who founded America were brilliant scholars who, although they were New Testament Christians, they had a very deep understanding of the Old Testament and the Torah. And we see, above all, that they recognize the existence of a single God. And they believe very strongly that a nation cannot exist without a belief that there is a God watching over it. And I remember once a rabbi said, just as the Jews were commanded to be a light unto the nations, America was founded on the idea that it would be a modern day light unto the nations. No society has ever had the kind of constitution that we have, reflecting the rights that we have. And the
Thank you.
and that's why people who come here, they clamor to come to this country from all over the world, and why they have such an emotional reaction when they first catch a glimpse of the Statue of Liberty sailing into New York Harbor with all that it represents. So I just want to read a couple of quick passages to support what I just said about our founding fathers' belief in God. And don't worry, I'm not going to read the whole Declaration of Independence. It's long. Most of it has to do with all the complaints they had against King George and why they were declaring a free country separate from England. But this is how it starts. I just want to read the very beginning and the very end. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. In simple English, it means we feel obligated to explain why we're declaring independence. This was on July 4th in Congress, 1776. And then comes what is probably the most famous passage in the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So there's a direct mention of their Creator being responsible for all of our rights. The Declaration ends, and this is the very last sentence, for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So there can be no question that the founders understood that a civilized society cannot exist without there being a creator, a God. And unfortunately, in today's secular world, sometimes people reject that notion. We know that the amendments to the Constitution contain the First Amendment. And the First Amendment, I have my little Constitution here. The First Amendment includes the following language: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, there are two aspects to that. The prohibition against establishing a religion, today, a lot of secular atheists interpret that to mean that the founders did not intend for there to be religion in our society, or at least in public. What this was focused on was not having a state religion. In other words, an official religion that everyone had to follow, which is the way it was in England. It had nothing to do with the existence of God in our society. And that is demonstrated by the next clause. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof, meaning that they expected there to be religious observance in society. Otherwise, they wouldn't need this language. And so it's clear that the Founding Fathers intended that religion be an active part of modern-day America, despite what some people say now. Now, in Pirkei Avot, we learn that the world endures on three things: justice, truth, and peace. And justice is listed first, and as Yoram said, we're told, tzedek, tzedek tirdaf, justice, justice shalt thou pursue. And I have this actually hanging on my chamber's wall in court to remind me of what my job is all about. It's a gift from my lovely wife when I first became a judge. And so the question is, what are these principles of justice on which a fair system is based? And of course there are differences. You know, Yoram mentioned the need for 2 or 3 witnesses to convict somebody of a crime. We don't have that, but there are a lot more similarities than there are differences. Strange as it may seem, I think one of the most fundamental principles of our legal system finds its source in this, what I think is a bizarre interchange between Avram and God over the announced destruction of Sodom. And if you have read that, you know, God announced he was going to destroy Sodom, and then there is this interchange where Avram says, well, what if there are 50 righteous people? Well, what if there are 45? What if there are 40? And I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I picture, every time I read that, I picture a child arguing with his father. Well, what if there are 45, Daddy? What if there are 40? But this principle, if a lawyer argued that way with me in court, he'd be going out the back door in handcuffs. But this important interchange established one of the most fundamental principles in our system of justice. And that is that regardless of what a person is accused of, regardless of the nature of their sin, they have a right to have someone argue on their behalf. And that's basically our right to counsel found in the Sixth Amendment. And the source of that is Abraham's conversation with Hashem. And it's a crucial component of what we call due process. Really, it means tzedek tirdaf. That's what due process is all about. And it's found in many places in the Constitution. And the same principle can be found in the Sanhedrin. Now, as I understand it, I heard a rabbi discussing this. For a Sanhedrin to find somebody guilty of a serious crime, you had to have 71 rabbis. And if all the rabbis voted guilty, the accused had to go free. Mm-hmm. There had to be somebody arguing on behalf of the accused. It's the exact same idea that we have in our Constitution. And, that's what people come to me and they say, how can these lawyers represent these rapists and murderers and child molesters? And I tell them they're not representing them as people. They're representing an idea, a right. Many of these lawyers have wonderful families, they have wives and children, and they detest what these people have done. But they're not representing them as people. They're representing their right to due process. So it's very, very important for people to understand that. Now, the rules of the Sanhedrin also embody another fundamental principle in our system, and that is that a verdict can only be reached based on the evidence, not on any bias for or against the accused or for witnesses, and Yoram touched on this. This is in our jury instructions, and you're going to see in a moment, and in our judicial canons of ethics. We have to take an oath that we will not be affected by any type of bias of any kind. Now, I heard a rabbi talking about the Sanhedrin, and based on the idea that if all 71 vote guilty, the accused has to go free. So this rabbi presented this fascinating hypothetical, and I want you to think about this. Suppose you had, by the way, this rabbi explained that when the Sanhedrin voted, the younger, less experienced rabbis would have to vote first, so they would not be influenced by the older, wiser rabbis. And so suppose you're the 71st rabbi, and you've just heard evidence relating to the guilt of a person whose guilt was crystal clear, a Hitler, Yamach Shemo, a Stalin, an Idi Amin, no question about guilt. All 70 rabbis before you have voted guilty. You know the evidence is overwhelming in support of guilt, but if you vote guilty, that person will go free. The question is, how do you vote? And the answer is, you have to vote according to the evidence, and the rest is up to Hashem. You cannot, and we find that principle, as you will see in our jury instruction. The jury is told, in reaching your verdict, you may not consider penalty or punishment. Otherwise, you might have a jury saying, well, I think he's guilty. The evidence is clear, but he seems like a nice guy, so I'm going to go ahead and vote not guilty because I don't want him to go to jail. Or vice versa. The evidence has not convinced me he's guilty, but the guy seems like a jerk, so I'm going to go ahead and vote guilty. Both would be wrong. And that's why you cannot consider penalty. It's unusual for us we're always told you should consider the consequences of everything you say and do. This is a situation where you're not allowed to. You just have to judge the evidence. And sometimes we get jurors who will say, when we're doing jury selection, my religion prohibits me from judging another human being. I'm sorry. And I tell them, you're not judging another human being. You're judging evidence. The verdict form doesn't say, we the jury find the defendant as a good person or a bad person. It says, we the jury find the defendant is either guilty or not guilty of a specific crime based on specific conduct. It has nothing to do with whether he's a good or bad person. So I tell them that. You're not judging the person. You're judging evidence. And that's a very important distinction. And so when the judge cannot consider and the jury cannot consider what kind of person he is while guilt is being determined. But afterwards, if the person is found guilty at sentencing, that's when the judge who does the sentencing can consider all the factors involving that person's life. How was he raised? What kind of parents did he have? Whatever constitutes either a mitigating or aggravating factor, the judge is allowed to consider. The only time the jury gets to decide punishment is in a death penalty case. When I was a prosecutor, I had a death penalty case involving the murder of 2 San Diego police officers. And the jury found the defendant guilty, and then there is a second trial where they have to decide between life without parole or death. And in my case, the jury decided on the death penalty. So that's the one situation where the jury gets to decide punishment, because it's such an extreme punishment that we don't want to leave it up to one judge.
In the criminal case.
Oh, yeah. And, Yoram mentioned that a society that has too many executions is not considered civilized. Actually, a lot of people don't know that Abraham Lincoln authorized 267 executions as President of the United States. So we're living in a little bit different world than the world of the Torah. Now, another important principle that was alluded to by Yoram, which is critical, is that we have to follow the law whether we agree with it or not. There is a concept called jury nullification that some people believe in, that the jury has the right to disregard the law. And that concept would lead to chaos, because it would allow people to decide which laws to obey and which laws not to obey. And as a judge, I've taken an oath to uphold the law whether I agree with it or not, and I have to pass that obligation on to the jury. And we question jurors at the beginning of the trial. Can you follow the law even if you disagree with it? And if they say no, then they can't serve as a juror. And in this packet I'm going to distribute, I wrote an article because there was a retired judge who seemed to be endorsing the idea of jury nullification. And the California Supreme Court has rejected that idea. And I wrote an article which was published rebutting what this judge was arguing and explaining why it would open a door that cannot be closed. And again, we would have a society that descends into chaos if we let everyone decide what laws are going to follow. And it's the same with the mitzvot. We have 613 mitzvot. Nobody follows all of them. But we're not allowed to say, well, you know, I like this one, so I'm going to obey. I'm going to follow this one. I don't like that one, so I'm going to disregard that one. So it's the same concept that we have in the Torah. On my bench in the courtroom, I have a cartoon that I save and look at from time to time to remind me of this concept. It shows Moshe standing on top of the mountain holding 2 tablets. And down below there's a crowd of people, and one of them has his hand raised. And a caption has Moses saying to him, listen, I don't care what your lawyer says, they're not called the 10 recommendations.
Good.
And, you know, when we talk about other things in the Torah, we have a prohibition in the 8th Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment. That's something else that comes from the Torah. We have to make sure the punishment fits the crime. And I once had somebody in my court, this is a bizarre twist on that idea. I had the option of sentencing him to up to 16 years in prison. His lawyer was arguing for 4. The district attorney wanted 16. I ended up sentencing him to 8 years in prison after reading the sentencing report, weighing all the factors, and, you know, I made my decision. After I sentenced him, he stood up and he started shouting at me. He said, Judge, I demand you impose the maximum sentence of 16 years. And you can imagine his lawyer's reaction. He's sitting there with his head in his hands. He just made this impassioned argument for 4 years. And I said, sir, I just evaluated your case, and I decided that 8 years was the appropriate punishment. Why would you want me to double your sentence? And his response was really heartbreaking. He said, because I can't make it out there. He said, in prison I have 3 meals and a bed. And when I get out, I'm just going to commit another crime so I can go back in. And so, you know, it's really heartbreaking when, you know, everyone works so hard to come up with a just sentence, and then you have a defendant who wants you to double it. So that was one of the many bizarre things I've had to deal with in my court. Now, I've discussed the basic principles. I just want to mention a couple of specific occurrences in my court, and then I'm going to pass out this material. At the beginning of every jury trial, I'm aware that many people who are summoned for jury duty are thinking of answers they can give to get out of jury duty because they have a cynical view of it. You know, they watch a lot of TV. I always tell jurors, forget everything you saw in Law and Order. It's a great show, great acting, great stories, nothing to do with reality. And so I try and let them know at the very beginning that they will be participating in one of the great democratic institutions in our society. The idea you're taking 12 people from 12 different walks of life who have never met each other, may never see each other again, forcing them into a room together and asking them to judge evidence relating to somebody they've never met before, applying laws they've never heard of. I mean, it sounds like an almost impossible task. And yet juries come to verdicts all the time. And so I tell them, I encourage them, I said, you will get to see the system from the inside in a way you can never learn about it on television. And so at the end of the questioning by the attorneys and by me, and by the way, one of the funniest answers I got, you know, we have a chart each juror has to go through: name, occupation, occupation of adults in your household, how many children do you have, and so forth. So this one woman said her name, she said her occupation, and when it came to occupation, and your honesty. One woman raised her hand and she said, Judge, I just want you to know that I've been diagnosed with muscular dystrophy and I have less than a year to live, and I would be honored to serve on this jury. And you can imagine after that, no one asked to be excused from the jury. And I told her, I said, you're my new hero. I said, for you to be facing what you're facing and want to fulfill your civic obligation to sit on the jury, to me, I'm very humbled. And they left her on the jury. I don't know if she's gone now or not, but I pray for her every day. But that's an example of somebody who takes their civic obligation seriously. Now, I'm almost finished. The Torah talks about the power of language, and Yoram just mentioned that. And that is so important in a courtroom setting. As judges, we have to be very careful about the words we use. In Pirkei Avot, it says, you should not let the witnesses learn. You don't want to lead witnesses to a certain answer, so you have to be very careful the way you phrase questions so that the witness doesn't guess from the way you're asking the question what you want to hear as the answer. And language comes, we have to require attorneys to be civilized to each other. But for 8 years, I presided over our court's mental health calendar. And dealing with the mentally ill, there were a lot of things that happened in that calendar that sound funny when you talk about them. But anyone who's had to deal with mental illness with a relative who has Alzheimer's or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder knows the heartbreak of mental illness. And my goal was always to let people leave with some dignity, with some sense that there was a judge who cared about them. But some funny things happened. One morning there was a woman who told me she was 14 months pregnant with Jesus. And then the same morning another patient told me he was Jesus. And I had to have my bailiff keep the two of them apart because it would have been an interesting scene. Mom, is that you? But these things happen. But one morning there was a woman, and I will never forget her. She was a Jewish woman, age 90, with Alzheimer's. Her name was Lillian Rose, and she was just the sweetest woman. And they rolled her into my court in a wheelchair, and her head was down. And the courtroom was filled with mental patients and their attorneys waiting to be heard. And this calendar consists of conservatorship cases, meaning the county files a petition to have somebody declared gravely disabled, meaning as a result of their mental health or mental disorder, they cannot provide for themselves food, clothing, or shelter. And then I establish a conservatorship and I determine where to place them. And San Diego has some very good facilities. We have a very good program for conservatorships. Anyway, so she was the first person on calendar, so the courtroom was full. And they rolled her forward, and she very slowly looked up from her wheelchair. Have a seat over there at the table. And the way these hearings work is the psychiatrist will testify what the disorder is, the diagnosis, the recommendations, and then the patient has an opportunity to testify, but they don't always. A lot of them say no. She wanted to testify. So my clerk said, please raise your right hand. She raised her right hand. Said, do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? And she responded, well, that's a silly question. Why, of course. What else would I do? From her laughing hysterically. And then the clerk said, please state your full name and spell your last name for the record. And she said, well, my name is Lillian Rose. And then she turned to me and said, Judge, do I really have to spell Rose for you? You've been through the first grade, haven't you? And now everyone was just losing it. And the reason I'm telling you this is because I sat there marveling at how you had a courtroom full of depressed people. And with a few words from this old woman with Alzheimer's, she brightened the lives of a courtroom full of mental patients, lawyers, a judge, court staff. We were talking about her for months. And I still remember her. That's why I'm telling this story. So it just shows you how powerful a few words can be in terms of improving somebody else's life. And of course the opposite's true. A few nasty words can ruin a person's life. I mean, I think your arm will tell you it can be like committing an act of murder. But so that's one example. Two other examples, and then I'll finish up. This is an example of how you can't escape Hashem's justice. I had a woman who was a sociopath, it was a fraud trial. She had about 5 disability contracts. She was being prosecuted for insurance fraud. And she was claiming total disability. She was basically faking illness. And I learned a lot from that case. For example, I learned, we all think it's very difficult to make those kinds of claims. And this doctor and the representative of the insurance company testified that actually it's quite easy when you say you're in total pain, because nobody can dispute it. If somebody tells you I'm in pain and there's no objective way to prove you're lying, if they don't sign off on it, they could be sued. So he said, actually, it's quite easy to say, I'm not giving you any ideas here, but it's quite easy to make a claim based on total pain. So she said she was in total pain. Unfortunately, the insurance companies had films of her. They call them sub rosa films. They're secret films that they take when they're suspicious, of her taking balloon rides in Temecula and climbing the Great Wall of China. Anyway, it was a 4-week trial. She was charged with about 35 counts. She was found guilty. And then on the sentencing day, she was on bail, so she was out. She came to court every day until the sentencing. She disappeared. And she ended up in Mexico. And I say she's a sociopath because she had the chutzpah to email the district attorney, catch me if you can. And they caught her.
Yeah, of course.
And I had sentenced her to 22 years in prison.
Well,
and the first year she was in prison, she was diagnosed with terminal cancer and died. Now think about this. She was in prison for faking illness. And the first year in prison, so you can try and fool Hashem, but it doesn't happen very often, ever. And in that case, there was a lot of this was a knockdown, drag-out trial. There was a private retained attorney from Los Angeles, excellent attorney, and an aggressive DA, and they were at each other's throats, and it was a challenge for me to maintain order in the court. In the middle of trial, I got a note from one of the jurors saying, "Judge, can we please take a break? I'm becoming physically ill because of the personal conflict between these attorneys." That's how bad it was getting. We took a break. I brought them back in. I talked to the attorneys. I said, "Counsel, there's too much heat and not enough light. You need to calm down and ask questions that matter and stay off of each other's throats." Well, I didn't know this juror was an artist. And so at the end of the trial, she sent me this gift where she quoted me, "Too much heat and not enough light." And it says, "Let's move on to questions that matter, Judge Shore."
Fantastic.
Yeah. So those are the kinds of things that that warm my heart. And Yoram had me repeat this story, and I know most of you have heard it, about the fellow that I had a sentence either to 6 years in prison or 6 years in a California Rehabilitation Center for narcotics addicts. And I felt I saw a lot of good things in his background, and I sent him to CRC instead of prison.
What's the CRC?
California Rehabilitation Center. And I said some very nice things to him to build him up and tell him, I think you have a bright future ahead of you. And years later, he came back to me, and he wanted to come to court and shake my hand and thank me for saving his life. That's what he told me. He got out of CRC. He got married. They were expecting their first child, and those things don't happen very often. If you're a judge and you expect everyone to love you, you're in for a very disappointing career. But when something like that happens, it really makes it makes my day. So before I hand out the material, I just want to conclude. I'm sorry Bernie's not here. This is his favorite story, and it's very brief. There was a fellow in the mental health calendar that refused to stop addressing me as Your Holiness. And the first time he said that, I said, sir, I really appreciate the promotion, but I'm just a judge. We're all naked in the shower. And at this stage in my life, Your Honor is all the respect I can handle. Can you please just call me Your Honor? And he responded, "Yes, Your Holiness." And this went on for about 20 minutes. And after he left, they took him out. His lawyer was waiting for some paperwork. And I was joking with his lawyer. I said, what really terrified me about that interchange was that toward the end, it was starting to sound good. I was considering having my bailiff change my opening from all rise to all kneel. But,
Chazak Baruch.
anyway,
Your Holiness, can we have a Q&A session?
let me pass these out. I just want to, and the reason I'm saving this is because I don't expect you to read all this now. I'm just going to point out a couple of quick things. The rest is for you to read at home when you have more time.
There'll be a test next week.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Keep on going, Howie. It's very interesting.
I have a question
You want to take?
about the jury.
Go ahead.
I'm not going to go because it's not my culture and it's not my language. And I don't want to put somebody in jail because I don't understand the lawyer very well.
Okay, if we've had people who have language difficulties, and that could be a reason to excuse you, but that would be for the judge and attorneys to decide, because we're a country of immigrants.
No, but I say I'm right to say that because sometimes
Oh, yeah, no.
Sometimes they tell me, oh no, you give excuse only because you speak English. I say, yeah, I know I speak English, but it's not my country. It's not my culture. It's not my language.
Well,
but the lawyers have words I never heard about them,
Right.
and they're very tricky, and they can make me like, oh, he's bad, this good,
well, it's up.
and it's my decision after that, and I can put somebody in jail.
Right. That's something, depending on the level of language. The fact that it's not your culture doesn't matter. What matters is whether you can understand the lawyers and the instructions of the court. And it depends on the case. There are some cases where the instructions are not very complicated, and some where they are. And so, the best thing to do is to respond and let the lawyers make that decision. And you can tell them, look, English is not my first language, and then they'll ask you follow-up questions. I've had many situations like that.
No, they're coming all the time. They let me go, but some people from the office over there, they give me a hard time. They're like,
Well,
you so many years in America. Your wife is American. You speak English, and I say, it's not my point. My point, it's not my language.
Yeah. Well,
because the lawyer is very, very sharp.
the main thing to do is not to try and get out of it when you check into the jury lounge. It's wait and see if you get sent to a courtroom, and then talk to them about it there. Okay.
That's
Now let me just. Does everyone have one of these?
No.
Thank you.
Let me just quickly go through this. The first two. Oh, here's more. You see the first instruction, 200, duties of judge and jury, that's read to the jury at the very beginning. And I don't want you to read the whole thing now, but the third paragraph says, do not let bias, sympathy, prejudice, or public opinion influence your decision. Okay, we talked about that. And I underlined the next part. You must follow the law as I explain it to you, even if you disagree with it. So that's the instruction that reflects what I was talking about. Now, if you go to the next instruction, 3550, this is read to the jury just before they retire to deliberate. Second paragraph, it is your duty to talk with one another and to deliberate in the jury room. You should try to agree on a verdict if you can. Each of you must decide the case for yourself, but only after you've discussed the evidence with the other jurors. Do not hesitate to change your mind if you become convinced you're wrong, but do not change your mind just because other jurors disagree with you. Okay? Now, on page 2 of that instruction, the next to the last sentence says what I said earlier. You must reach your verdict without any consideration of punishment.
Did you ever sit in the jury?
No, I've been summoned, and we had one judge who actually got to sit on a jury. I haven't yet. I would love to.
I think it should be a requirement for the judge to hear what's going on the other side of the wall.
Well, except
And you
it's
will
up
be
to the lawyers.
surprised.
The lawyers get to
Yeah, I
excuse
know.
you. So, now, if you look at the page that's entitled California Rules of Court, General Objectives in Sentencing. Now, look at how many of these principles are contained in the Torah. General objectives, and this is what guides all judges in sentencing, include protecting society, punishing the defendant, encouraging the defendant to lead a law-abiding life in the future, and deterring him or her from future offenses, deterring others from criminal conduct by demonstrating its consequences, preventing the defendant from committing new crimes by isolating him or her for the period of incarceration, securing restitution for the victims of crime, achieving uniformity in sentencing, and increasing public safety by reducing recidivism through community-based corrections programs and evidence-based practices. Now, notice subparagraph B, which is obvious but critical. Because in some instances these objectives may suggest inconsistent dispositions, the sentencing judge must consider which objectives are of primary importance in the particular case. That's very important discretion for a judge. An example, I had a fraud case. It was an elder abuse fraud case. And those are terrible cases where you have people who've worked all their lives and they've got their money saved up, and some con artist steals all their money, based on they're naive, and they go to them and say, hey, look, I've got this great business opportunity. And that's what this fellow did. And unfortunately, he happened to be Jewish, but that's not relevant to my story, but I'm just mentioning that. Criminals come in all sizes, shapes, and religions. Anyway, he stole over $1 million from 5 different elderly couples, all of their life savings. So we come to sentencing. Now, the maximum he could do under the plea agreement was 9 years. I had the option of deciding how much of those 9 years he would do in prison and how many under supervision. Now, notice the different, obviously I wanted to punish him. You can't let somebody like that get away with what he did. But I also wanted to secure restitution for the victims. And the longer he was out, the more money he would be able to accumulate to pay the victims back. He knew that, and he came to court with $200,000 on the day of sentencing, which was like a down payment, for over $1 million, but it was a significant amount. Well, as a judge, I can't let people think they can buy their way out of a crime. So I have to decide, how do I balance these factors that are listed here? Well, I ended up, he wanted house arrest. He wanted 1 year in his home. And, he was a sociopath, basically. I said, forget that. I ended up sentencing him to 4 years in prison and 5 years on supervision, and ordered him to make the remainder of restitution during that period. And, he complained, he said, well, I have children. I said, this is not the time to think about that. The time to think about that is before you commit the crime, not afterwards.
Very good.
So you should have thought about that before you committed the crime. I can't be concerned with the fact you have children. And it sounds harsh, but, it's true. Otherwise, people with children could commit a crime and then, throw children in your face and say, you can't punish me. All right, so those are the sentencing rules. Now, the next page is the letter I wrote regarding jury nullification. Again, read it at home. But I point out why it would be a terrible thing to allow people to disregard the law, why you have to follow the law. And the final article is a lengthy article I wrote after I prosecuted that death penalty case. I was asked by the Lawyers magazine in San Diego at the time to write an article in support of the death penalty. And I did a lot of research, and I explained why our law is a moral teacher, and why, aside from any deterrent effect it may have or may not have, there are certain people whose crime is so horrendous that they deserve to forfeit their life, which I think reflects a Torah principle as well. And so the last few pages are that article. There was also...
That was a great picture of you, by the way.
I'm glad it's dark. I don't look like that in real life. But, so it was point, counterpoint. There was also an article opposing capital punishment. I did not reproduce that article. But anyway, those are some tidbits that you can take home and review. And anyway, I hope,
Thank you so much. Absolutely amazing. Shkoach. Thank you. We have 2 questions. 2 questions. Anybody?
I promise, never.
2 questions. Anybody wants to ask?
I have a
You might
question.
be accepted.
Your Honor, we have a question here.
Yes.
I was chosen, I was a juror. There were 7 ladies and 5 gentlemen.
Okay.
And we here 10 days we were in court, and then we had 2.5 days, to review the case. We all felt guilty. It was drugs.
Okay.
A young lady that drove from Mexico and brought drugs to Pomona, and they had pictures and they had everything. all the evidence. We had border patrol people that took picture of her, and she converted cars. One of the everything after 2.5 days, we came with a verdict. One guy insisted it was under duress. I had to look at the dictionary. What exactly is duress? What does it mean by that? It's such a complicated language and such a complicated word. What happened? Okay, we came. They couldn't. Is there another court after that?
Well, what happened? You had a hung jury?
Yeah.
You couldn't reach a verdict?
No.
Yeah, that happens.
One person,
yeah,
we tried to convince him.
I've had 11-1 hung juries also. They have the discretion to do another trial, or they can try and resolve the case. For example, if it's 11-1 for guilty, the attorneys will find that out at the end. They're going to get together, and the defense attorney is going to say, look, we escaped this time, but it was 11-1 for guilty. How about a plea deal? Because it sounds like he'll be found guilty the next time. So yes, you can try the case again.
It was for sure guilty. Really.
I've had cases like that. I had
so many evidence and so much, against her.
Well, that's the beauty of our system. It can be frustrating at times, but that's why we require the vote of 12 people in a criminal case. In a civil case, it's only 9 out of 12. If 9 out of 12